throughout the program. I see that folks are still coming in. We're so grateful to have you all joining us tonight. Since it's already a couple minutes after the hour and we have a packed evening, we're going to go ahead and get started. We have live captions at tonight's event. To turn them on, please click the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. If you have any trouble figuring out how to turn the captions on, please message the event host in the chat. We start this evening by acknowledging that the ACLU of Illinois is located on the traditional homelands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Muscatan, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These Native nations were forcibly removed, and the stories of their struggles for survival remain embedded in the land. These issues are particularly resonant as we talk about state violence and accountability this evening. We are here to discuss the urgent issue of police accountability and the need to pass House Bill 1727, the Bad Apples in Law Enforcement Accountability Act, introduced by Representative Tarver, one of our panelists tonight. It's difficult to talk about these issues as we mourn the death of Adam Toledo, a child of Chicago who was killed by police last month. Our hearts are with Adam Toledo's family, the community, and all those named and unnamed victims of police violence. Time and again, the system fails to hold police accountable. Ending qualified immunity will not solve all of our problems with policing, but it is a critical tool to increase accountability of law enforcement and why we must pass House Bill 1727. Before we get started with the panel, it is my absolute delight to welcome Chicago's first poet laureate, Emmalee Lauren. Emmalee will be performing her piece, Speak, a poem about the power of using your voice. Our voice is one of our most sacred foundational rights, and it is a powerful tool for change. I'll turn it over to you, Emmalee.
Yay! Peace, everybody. Happy Monday. I'm so excited to be here with ACLU again. I appreciate it. As mentioned, I will be sharing a poem titled Speak, which is a manifesto of my language that is inspired and evolved by my city, by the people of my city, and the people who make it move. Thank you so much. I got a family reunion in my mouth, church under my tongue, loud, packed, loose squared language, bootlegged babble, mild, saucy, and slick, quick card cracking grammar, squad a sanctuary on my top lip, throw the handles of my cheeks, what's good in the hood of your mouth, the yo in my yarn, a fugaze flat flick of tongue south side stick slobbered, a candy lady's cabinet, bud and MC light, a boombox on my beak, suited and booted, food and liquor leaking, tripping on my tonsils, A1 and AK-47s, the rink skating on my nose, and what consent means my guts belong to Giovanni and Jasmine, a different world in a Dutch masters, elbows off the tables of my teeth, don't you have any manners, melanin in the suck, Auntie Pokey neck row caught in my throat, I speak a queer language, color-coded, no code switch, a swap, I hold a rainbow coalition on my tongue, Obamacare in my back throat, let my mom claim the baby in my teeth for tax season, I speak sacrifice, Urban Dictionary in the suburbs, know my rights and speak them, loud, like my music, like my body, like my bossy, I speak my bossy, I speak Trina and Cardi B, I speak woman runs the house, I speak field and house, I speak house, Chicago, 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 red line lingering licks, I speak sharp swords, Bible translation of revenues, avenues to boulevards, Cabrini mouth, mom greens, declare course on 26th in California, I speak free my mans, I speak free my energy, I speak in royalist and concrete queendoms. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Iman, for that powerful performance and for inspiring all of us to use our voice to speak up for the things that matter to us. Throughout the program tonight, we'll be asking audience poll questions. Please keep an eye out for them on your screen. Let's get started with our first one of the evening. How would you rate your understanding of qualified immunity? 1, I don't know what qualified immunity is. 2, I have some understanding of qualified immunity. 3, I have a strong understanding of qualified immunity. Again, that's 1, I don't know what qualified immunity is. 2, I have some understanding of qualified immunity. 3, I have a strong understanding of qualified immunity. Don't worry if you don't have a strong understanding of qualified immunity yet. We've got you covered. We're going to dig into it tonight. We received a number of questions in advance that will help shape our discussion. You can submit questions during the conversation by putting them in the chat or email them to events@aclu-il.org. We'll try to get to as many as possible. On our panel tonight, we are joined by David Franco, a retired Chicago Police Department officer, professor at Wright College, and member of Law Enforcement Action Partnership. We are also joined by Jerry Greenfield, co-founder of Ben & Jerry's and co-chair of the National Campaign to End Qualified Immunity. We're also joined by Peter Hanna, ACLU of Illinois Legal Director, and Illinois State Representative for the 25th District, Curtis Tarver II. Thank you all for being with us. Let's dive right in. The first question is for all of our panelists. Last week, even as Derek Chauvin's trial was underway in Minnesota and efforts to hold him accountable for the killing of George Floyd were proceeding, just a few miles away, Brooklyn Center Police killed Daunte Wright during a traffic stop. What will it take for us to get to a place where police officers are not killing Black and brown people? If we could start with you, Representative Tarver, that would be great.
The question is, what can we do to ensure that police officers stop killing Black and brown people?
Yeah, what's it going to take for us to get to a place where police officers are not killing Black and brown people?
I mean, I think in a word, it would have to be accountability. Some notion that if they continue to go down this path, that there'll be some kind of actual accountability and not a slap on the hand and not a, get out of jail free card, but actual legitimate accountability, which is why we need to eliminate things like qualified immunity, which provide a kind of absolute shield for those officers.
Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else from the panel want to chime in, give your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like to just pick up on, this is Peter Hanna, I'm a legal advisor at the ACLU of Illinois, and picking up on what Representative Tarver just said, I think it will take Black and brown and white people and people of all backgrounds telling our leaders that we can no longer accept this status quo. We can't just have this as sort of the America that we live in, where Black and brown people and people, who are, just interacting with police regularly are killed over nothing and for no reason. So it's upon us, the people, to demand our leaders take action. And like Rep. Tarver said, demand accountability from police.
Thanks, Peter. Jerry or David?
Yeah, it's going to take a lot, actually, but certainly focusing on accountability, I think for all of us here is critical. I speak as a business person for over 40 years, and one thing Ben and I have come to realize is that accountability is the key to achieving desired results. And if you don't have it, you don't have anything. So I think just the fact that we're here today with Rep. Tarver and ACLU to be talking about this critical issue shows how important accountability is.
I do agree. I think that accountability by police, by law enforcement, is important because if without that, I don't believe that the community feels that police are legitimate with their authority. So I think that's really a very a problem. I also think that the war on drugs is something that is a the disproportionate contact between the police and the Black and brown communities is the suspicion of drug sales or drug activities, and that's caused by the war on drugs.
Thank you guys all for sharing that. So one of the themes that everybody touched on was accountability. Earlier this year, the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus led the passage of the Safety Act, and now it has been signed into law. This law is an important step towards improving the policing and criminal legal systems. One of the questions we received in advance asked why we need this bill in addition to the Safety Act. Representative Tarver, can you share about why you introduced HB 1727?
Well, to be clear, I was a proponent of essentially this bill being included in the overall package. So I was probably the person who was most dismayed and frustrated when it did not stay in the entire overall package. So the reason why I introduced the bill is because, again, getting back to accountability, and you mentioned that the larger package is a step in the right direction, but it's not the conclusion of the goal. And I just tend to think that as long as people know that there's this kind of shield that you just really cannot get around, unless you have, unless you're unfortunate enough to the same exact situation that someone else had, and the court ruled, in their favor to some extent. Short of that, you're just out of luck. And so I don't think that's a fair standard for individuals. And I don't think that we should be essentially having a very egregious case of first precedent, first time it's come around, and it gets kicked just because nothing that bad has happened before. I just don't think that's the type of precedent we need in the legal system, especially when we provide law enforcement so much authority and such a long leash to do what they, have determined to be within the scope of their job.
Thanks for sharing that. Building on that, Peter, HB 1727 would end qualified immunity in Illinois. Can you share a little bit about what qualified immunity is, where it comes from, and give us some examples of instances in which police have used qualified immunity to avoid accountability?
Yeah, of course. And I want to thank Rep. Tarver for initially, teeing that up so well for me. So first, I think it's important to say what qualified immunity isn't. So qualified immunity has nothing to do with criminal liability. It has nothing to do with indemnification of police. I think those are really common misconceptions. And what it really is it's a legal doctrine created by the Supreme Court in 1982 that prevents courts from even considering claims that a police officer violated someone's constitutional rights unless that person can identify, here's the term, clearly established law. And that means basically a previous Supreme Court decision that declares that exactly what the police officer did was unconstitutional. In Illinois, we also have tort immunity, which achieves the same basic result as qualified immunity. So one of the very strangest things I've always found about this doctrine is it creates the very odd scenario where the more creative a police officer is in violating someone's rights, the broader the scope of their qualified immunity protection, right? Because the more creative sorts of violations, of course, are less likely to have a court case earlier that provides precedent that that's unconstitutional. And there are lots of examples, Emmalee. One that is very illustrative is a case called Baxter v. Bracey that was out of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. In that case, the court granted immunity to police officers who used a police dog against a suspect who had already surrendered and was sitting on the ground with their hands up. The plaintiff in that case had actually identified a very, very similar case where a court had previously held unconstitutional the police use of dogs on a suspect who had surrendered, but they said qualified immunity applied in this case because in that first case, the suspect was lying face down and they'd surrendered that way. But in this case, they were on their knees with their hands up. And they said that in this case, because of qualified immunity, the claim gets dismissed. And kind of building on what Rep. Tarver said, or kind of circling back, this is what qualified immunity does. It basically creates a strange situation where unless you could find a case that's exactly on point, declaring exactly what happened to you unconstitutional, you're out of luck, your claim is dismissed, and the court doesn't even get to decide whether, this police officer violated the Constitution.
Thanks, Peter. So after hearing that description of qualified immunity, before we move on, let's do another quick poll. People need to have the power to sue law enforcement officers in order to hold them accountable whenever they violate a person's constitutional rights. Please pick from one of the below answers: strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. Again, the prompt is people need to have the power to sue law enforcement officers in order to hold them accountable whenever they violate a person's constitutional rights. Give folks just a couple more seconds to think about their responses. Thanks to everybody for participating. All right, Jerry, I'm moving to you. Your campaign to end qualified immunity lifts up the stories of impacted folks. Could you talk a little bit about why it is so critical to share these stories in our efforts to push for police accountability?
Yeah, sure. Stories are so important to help people understand just how deep police brutality cuts into our communities. It's not just about accountability. It's not just about policy. These are real people. We say their rights are violated. What we really mean is that they've been maimed, brutalized, even killed. These are real people. Ben Cohen, who's the other co-chair of the campaign to end qualified immunity, just came out with a new book. It's called Above the Law: How Qualified Immunity Protects Violent Police. And it tells stories, just as Peter Hanna was telling one story. I'll add one just as an example. Gabriel Windsor was riding his bike 100 yards away when he was shot 17 times and killed by the police. The police were responding to calls about a Black man who wore a brown shirt, and Gabriel was wearing a blue shirt. And despite this, the police escaped punishment because of qualified immunity. It's a fundamentally unfair and unjust policy, and it disproportionately impacts Black and brown people.
David, turning to you, from the perspective of a former law enforcement officer, you've said that ending qualified immunity will make communities safer. How will it do that?
Well, under the qualified immunity doctrine, there are, as Jerry pointed out, many instances of police not being held accountable for their action in violation of someone's rights. So the community sees this lack of accountability, and that builds a distrust with not only the police, but also the system itself, for that matter. It also can create fear in communities to come forward about activity that is going on within that community. So I believe that ending qualified immunity will begin to rebuild the trust with the community that has been lost under this doctrine. So once legitimacy is conferred to the police, studies have shown that when people view the police as a legitimate and appropriate legal authority, they are more likely to defer to the police in personal encounters and to cooperate with the police when asked to. Furthermore, people who view police as legitimate are more likely to comply with the law in their everyday lives, and they're more apt to monitor their communities, report crimes, identify criminals, and most importantly, come forward as witnesses.
Thanks so much for sharing that, David. So Rep. Tarver, turning back to you, more than 90% of Illinoisans statewide believe that police should be held accountable when they violate someone's constitutional rights. I was raised in a really small community downstate, and sometimes you hear people say that policing is just a problem in the cities. We all know that's not true, but can you talk about the challenges a lack of accountability creates for folks in communities across the state, And, you know, in other words, why do we need a statewide solution to ending blanket qualified immunity?
Well, look, I mean, I think, um, the reality is that this issue focuses, or it really is highlighted in a couple of different areas, right? Black and brown people for the most part. And you might be surprised to know that Black and brown people live some of everywhere throughout the state. So while we may be concentrated in certain parts of, Chicago, we live everywhere throughout the state. But I think to David's point, in general, if people don't trust police, don't trust the system, I think it leads to less crimes being solved. If I'm concerned about, talking to you one day and having a solid conversation and being shot for wearing the wrong color t-shirt, to Jerry's point, the next day, what kind of relationship does that really build? What kind of trust is really established? And again, that's not to suggest that throughout the entire state, every police officer is bad. But look, the reality is that throughout the entire state, there are individuals in every department who just are the bad apples. I don't know a better way to put it. And so when people don't understand, that there'll be some accountability for those people and for those officers, that creates, very significant issues in the community.
Yeah, to build on what Rep. Tarver's saying, this is not an anti-police measure at all. The only people who benefit from qualified immunity are bad cops. It's a get out of jail free card for bad cops. If cops are operating in good faith, they have very strong constitutional protections. So this would not affect that.
Thanks for sharing that. So, Peter, let's assume for a moment that the bill has passed the House, it's passed the Senate, it's been on Governor Pritzker's desk, he's signed it into law. Can you tell us how this bill becoming law would change things for people who are on the receiving end of the horrific examples of police violence that we've heard about already?
Yeah, and I do want to add one thing to what Representative Tarver and Jerry just said, which is, when I think people are having conversations about qualified immunity with their friends and family and police officers, I just want to be clear that this isn't like a radical measure we're talking about here. We're simply talking about creating or eliminating a barrier, an almost insurmountable barrier for people who try to get justice when their constitutional rights are violated by, a bad apple or the bad apples we hear so much about. So you asked how this would change, things for people who are on the receiving end of police violence. So at the very, the first way I would explain it is it guarantees a baseline, sort of a ground level, a floor, if you will, of real police accountability. It means that even when the criminal justice system fails to prosecute a police officer for doing something, really atrocious, when a police department fails to adequately discipline someone on the force for doing something really bad. And I mean, we know that, of course, Derek Chauvin had, I think, 18 complaints against him before ultimately he killed George Floyd. Jason Van Dyke had, almost the same number of complaints before he killed Laquan McDonald. So at least, if we're not getting, good discipline from the police force, if the police can't police themselves, if the criminal justice, criminal legal system can't go after police who break the law, this bill creates a ground floor level of police accountability, because when a police officer does violate someone's constitutional rights, they know they can't just, hold a piece of paper, just like Jerry said, a get out of jail free card that says qualified immunity, and deny access or even entry into the courthouse where a court can actually determine, did the person's constitutional rights get violated? So we take that away, and now we empower courts and juries who, we trust them to make decisions in criminal prosecutions. We trust them with the most important matters in our society. We empower them to look at the facts and determine, did the police officer act constitutionally or not? So I think it gives, at least people, victims of, egregious constitutional violations by police, the possibility, just the opportunity to get justice. And I think for communities who have been harmed by police violence, for a very long time, it gives them the opportunity finally to start to heal and to say, those people that are patrolling my community right? At least on some level, they can be held accountable, if not by the criminal legal system, if not by their own police department, by me, by the community, by us. And that's really what HB 1727 is all about, and why I'm so grateful for Rep. Tarver's leadership and courage in bringing this important bill forward.
Thanks, Peter. We've seen bills to end qualified immunity introduced and passed in some cases around the country in recent years. How does this bill compare to other bills that have been passed, in New Mexico, Colorado, New York City? To anybody, anyone on the panel?
Yeah, I could speak to it. So I mean, New York City was a city council measure, and it only applies to NYPD. And I think I commend the New York City Council for stepping forward and doing that. But it's going to be tough. New Mexico eliminated qualified immunity for all public officials. That is not what this bill that we have in Illinois would do. This bill would eliminate qualified immunity and state tort immunity, which again is similar and has a similar effect for police officers. And I want to be really clear, who violate our constitutional rights. So this is not, it doesn't go as far as New Mexico. It does not apply to all public officials. I don't think all public officials carry guns and have the blessing of the state to kill if necessary. It's really only police officers who have that power, and police officers who are responsible for killing more than 1,000 American civilians each year. So it's a very, I would say, tailored bill. It's a very narrow bill, no matter what opponents might say about it. It's targeted directly towards unconstitutional actions and unconstitutional conduct by police. It also has a measure in it that discourages frivolous lawsuits. Sometimes we hear, oh, well, I'm going to handcuff someone's handcuffs too tight and they're going to sue me. Well, this bill that Rep. Tarver has introduced has a provision that says specifically, if you bring a frivolous lawsuit, the court can punish you, can sanction you for that. So it really does strike a very reasonable balance, all things considered. And we're not asking police for very much. We're just asking them to please stand up and be accountable when you violate people's constitutional rights, if not, again, for the legal system or the internal disciplinary measures to the public that the police serve.
Yeah, I think one thing to note is that this is a national movement. There is movement at both the federal level and, as you say, in states. It's been enacted in Colorado, it's been enacted in New Mexico and New York City. There's activity in many other states. But what's so critical is to get something going here in Illinois. The federal activity moves very, very slowly. But here we have an incredible opportunity to make something constructive happen and do it. We're part of a national coalition of 16 nonprofit organizations that have a wide range, from the ACLU to the Leadership Conference, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And also on the libertarian side, there's the Cato Institute and the Institute for Justice. There's very broad support for ending qualified immunity. On the Supreme Court, Sonia Sotomayor and Clarence Thomas, two people who are at opposite ends on most issues, think this ought to be ended. And right here, right now in Illinois, we can make it happen.
That's right, Jerry, we can. And we need everybody. I'm just going to take this another opportunity just to tell everybody, please, we're going to drop the number in the chat where you can directly call your legislators to urge them to support and sponsor HB 1727. It's so important. And, we really need everybody to pick up the phone, call your legislators, send emails, make your voice heard. So Jerry, sticking with you just for a moment, you and Ben, the two co-founders of Ben and Jerry's, have been, at the forefront of so many important social justice issues. Why is it important for business leaders, athletes, and artists to support ending qualified immunity? And how do we engage them in this fight?
Yeah, thank you. Every voice matters in this effort, obviously, but it's our experience that politicians listen more to business people and to people that have large public profiles, athletes, celebrities, what have you. And after the murder of George Floyd, business leaders spoke out as never before, and we wanted to engage them. But business leaders need to do more than just speak out. Business has a lot of influence on through lobbying on what laws are enacted. In addition, we've connected with over 1,400 athletes through the Players Coalition that's supporting this. As I mentioned earlier, it's very broad and very wide support. We just need to get all the voices, every constituent, to be in touch with their legislators.
Thanks, Jerry. So Rep. Tarver, turning back to you, as Jerry just said, all of our voices are important. In what ways can all of us on this call help bring about the long overdue changes to policing that we're asking for? How can we engage with our local and state elected officials, and more importantly, make them listen to us?
Great question. I mean, I think the most immediate thing is what you mentioned earlier, whether it's calling or emailing their offices, and letting them know that this is an important bill and it matters. Because it's very easy when people say, hey, nobody in my district called me about this. This is not an issue. And to your point earlier, it's easy to say it's just a Chicago issue. And then you don't have to necessarily deal with it in central Illinois or other places. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is have some very honest conversations within your own circle. I mean, have some tough conversations with people because it could be an opportunity to change their perspective. As well, I think too often we may just call a legislator and tell legislators what we think, but we don't have these conversations around the dinner table or when we're at brunch with friends and things like that. But these are the tough conversations that we have to have because, again, it's a life or death. It's a life or death matter for many of us who just want to, ironically, I just want to go to and from Springfield safely. I want to make it home without a traffic stop becoming an execution. And so, I think those are a couple of ways that people can engage their constituencies.
Yeah. Sorry, Rep. Tarver. I just wanted to share my own experience. So, when I was a law student, I was, pulled over for going a couple of miles over the speed limit in an area not far from where I live. And, the police officer, basically came up and told me I was going below the speed limit. Said I didn't think so. And he ordered me to get out of the car. And when I asked this police officer, I was kind of shocked. Said, why? He took a step back. He unclasped his gun. He put his hand on the holster, and he took the posture of someone that we've all seen in movies and in real life, unfortunately, many times, of someone ready to draw their weapon. That was really the extent of our interaction up until that point. And for a moment, I was a third-year law student at the time, and I had enough criminal procedure and criminal law knowledge to think to myself, this person really, he might just kill me. He really might just shoot me. And my family would never be able to get any sort of answer. I mean, he probably, I don't know if he'd ever be prosecuted or if he'd ever be convicted. I don't know if he'd ever be disciplined. I don't know if my family, if they sued, if they'd ever recover anything, if they'd ever get the truth, if they'd ever hold this person accountable. And I don't know if any other people who interact with this officer or his colleagues would come to the same end. And I had that all go through my head. And I mean, no one should be having that thought. No one should be having that thought. This is not a big ask. This is the very moderate ask. This is the really incremental ask where we're asking the legislators to show, the courage and sort of the leadership necessary to say, hey, if we want to keep this thing going, if we think that this has value for our society, right, let's at least make these police, these public servants, accountable for when they do the absolute worst thing, constitutional violations. These are the things that really undergird our entire, society, our state government, our national government. So I don't want anyone, I don't want, Rep. Tarver's family or kids, anyone who's watching this to ever have that experience. I don't want anyone to ever have an interaction with a police officer in Illinois and think to themselves, this person could kill me or destroy my life or hurt me in another way, and I can't do anything about it. That is a really, really hard thing to internalize. And we've normalized it for way too long, partially because of qualified immunity. That's why this bill is so important, and why, as Rep. Tarver said, and others have said, it is essential that everyone listening today not just contact the representatives and demand that they support this important bill, but also amplify the message, share it with their networks, get the word out, use the materials that we're going to make available, and I know the ACLU will circulate, to make sure everyone knows that this is necessary, so that no one feels like Rep. Tarver did when he was driving to the Capitol, like I felt, like so many other people do on a daily basis. And for many of them, too many of them, ends in death or something else. It's really terrible.
Yeah, as Peter said earlier, and as he referenced just now, we need to understand that we are authorizing police to use deadly force in our name and with our money. And that's the reason why it's even more important to have accountability. They're the people that we put guns in their hands. It's unconscionable that there is no accountability for that role.
Thank you all for sharing. Staying with that for a little bit, Rep. Tarver, so, I mentioned earlier, 90% of Illinoisans are in favor of police accountability. One of the questions we received in advance asked, who opposes this bill? So first, why do you think there's opposition to passing a bill that has such broad public support, and who is the opposition?
The short answer to the first question is the race of the individuals who have been harmed. There's no doubt about it. If we saw a black male with his knee on a white woman's neck or a white man's neck for 9 minutes, there'd be, something would happen. There's no doubt about that, right? If we saw, and we did see this, right, in Minnesota, when a black officer shot a white woman, I think he got jail time, right? So we've seen these situations, but we don't really see very much again in the civil space. And I think that part of why you have so much opposition are a few things. One, there's this notion of like good guys and bad guys. Well, when most people who are arrested are black and brown, it's always just innately, we are the bad guys, which makes, conversely, officers the good guys, and so I think that's an issue. There's so many people who can say, well, that's never happened to me or anybody that I know, because we're also very segregated and we don't interact with folks who don't look like us often or whatever, right? And so I think all of these things, fit into it. And then let's just be honest. I mean, look at who's on the force. Look who's put in there, 25, 30 years, collecting a pension and going back to become a school resource officer. And now they're making 6 figures, right? With just unfettered ability to do whatever it is that they want. I mean, anytime you try to take something away from people, there's going to be some angst and some pushback. And when you look at police forces, which have historically, just like other labor unions as well, been exclusive, to Black and brown people and others, it's a good old boys club, and I think they want to keep it the way that it's been for a long period of time. That's my, estimation. As I see someone in the chat call me a racist, I'm just being honest, So those are my thoughts.
And I did want to point out one thing just that occurred to me, as people think about taking action to prevent this and to overcome the opposition that we just heard Rep. Tarver speak to, where tomorrow is actually a very important anniversary. April 20th is the date that 150 years ago, to the day, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the first civil rights bill into law in the United States. That's the Civil Rights Act of 1871, also known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. And it was passed basically to provide people with, this is going to not surprise anyone, the opportunity to sue public officials who violate their constitutional rights in court. The bill that Rep. Tarver has introduced is modeled after that very important law, which later was codified in federal law as Section 1983. But of course, again, completely undermined by the creation of the modern qualified immunity doctrine by the Supreme Court in 1982, and that's where we're at today. So I think as people, pick up the phone, share with their friends, share on social media, amplify this message, keep in mind that we are at a particularly sort of unique moment in American history and the story of civil rights in America, because here we are a century and a half later, and we're still dealing with public officials, specifically police, of course, killing people of color and being unaccountable for it. We can change it, and we have to change it, because the alternative is really, it's unthinkable, which is just accepting this again and again and again. So please keep that in mind and have that in your heart as you make these calls and you fight for this, because we all have to fight for this together. If we want the promise of civil rights, century plus old, to actually come to fruition.
David, I'd love to follow up about the opposition. We've seen so much pushback from law enforcement on this bill, and just wondering from your perspective why there is so much pushback and where police unions stand on this bill.
Well, what I've encountered in terms of the pushback is, the argument that I've encountered is that without qualified immunity, police officers, first of all, are going to stop doing their job. And I believe that premise is false. So the police officers that I've known have law enforcement and service to the public as part of they're hardwired for that. And that's what they want to do. So I don't believe that is going to be an issue. We already have the Fourth Amendment as police officers' protection. So if they've acted in good faith and within the tenets of the Fourth Amendment by not conducting an unreasonable search or seizure, there shouldn't be a problem. I think that the leadership of the unions have to emphasize that and not have to ramp up this almost hysteria, like everything you're not going to be able to do your job. You're going to get sued for, as Peter said, if you put the handcuffs on somebody that's too tight, they're going to take your house. It's just not, that's not going to happen, particularly with this bill.
So on that, just sticking with that for a second, Dave, we did receive a number of questions in advance asking if this bill would discourage good people from becoming police officers or cause current officers to leave. So would love to just, have you share a little bit about what you would say to a police officer who's worried about losing blanket qualified immunity once this becomes law and is questioning whether or not they could do their job. What would you say to a current officer that's making that argument?
Well, as I said previously, the pushback is going to come from the unions and also from, I don't want to qualify them as dinosaurs, but in terms of realizing the progressive direction that law enforcement needs to move towards, and this is certainly falls into that category. If that's going to, but the other thing is this. So if you're a doctor, or you want to become a doctor, and you know that if something happens and you make a mistake or something in your professional life and you get sued, that doesn't stop medical schools from operating. We've got malpractice insurance, and there's ways to work that out within the system. So I don't know if you want to become a police officer, that's really going to deter you, because ultimately, every police officer, even my students in my classes, What they ultimately want to do is, and I asked them, why do you want to become a police officer? And they say they want to help. They want to help people. They want to make things better. So if they focus on that and working within the boundaries of rules, regulations, and the Constitution, they're not going to have a problem.
Thanks, David. So we also received a few questions in advance about how this bill would be applied if it's passed and signed into law. And we've heard some folks claim that this bill will make police officers defenseless against lawsuits for like handcuffs that are a little bit too tight. Peter, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Dave just said, kind of building on that, a lot of times law enforcement representatives from law enforcement sort of conflate qualified immunity with the extremely deferential standard the Supreme Court has articulated and reinforced and reinforced and reinforced for decades under the Fourth Amendment. And that standard has nothing to do with qualified immunity. In fact, the big case that, the most recent, like big case is called Graham v. Connor. And in that case, the court states what its standard is. And it says ultimately, when you're determining whether excessive force was used in violation of the Constitution, you have to be, 1, deferential to the police officer's split-second decision-making. 2, do not judge the action with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. 3, understand that in the circumstances, police work in a very chaotic setting. So it creates this extremely significant amount of leverage, deference, I should say, for police actions. So if you got rid of qualified immunity today, and you were looking at, something that happened, a jury wouldn't just be, told, well, did what the police officer did bad? Is it something you disapprove of? They would be asked to apply the standard I just spoke to. They'd be asked to judge the police officer's actions in an extremely deferential posture under the circumstances and ask, were they reasonable under the circumstances? So this bill, and I mean, this is one of the things that I think is very frustrating for activists and advocates who are trying to achieve meaningful reform and accountability. This bill does not mean that police will be sort of defenseless. Quite the opposite. Most of the most powerful defenses police have are beyond the qualified immunity barrier. You get rid of qualified immunity, you still have, a multitude of procedural and substantive defenses to get through. And in addition, you have this Supreme Court deference that's baked into any sort of decision making. So yes, if any of us are on a jury and the claim really is, my handcuffs were too tight, well, 1, that would never ever reach a jury under this bill. It just wouldn't. And 2, if it somehow something like that did, the question that you would be asked is, was this reasonable under the circumstances? And that is a very deferential standard. So this bill, when passed into law, is not going to, do what I think some of its opponents say, which is expose people to, potential litigation for every interaction with police. It just eliminates the barrier that prevents so many cases from ever achieving justice and police officers from ever having any ground level of accountability.
Thanks, Peter. So we only have about 10 minutes left, and there are still so many questions that we got in advance and that have been coming through in the chat. So I just want to get to a few more. Peter, sticking with you, if you could briefly share with us, in response to calls to end qualified immunity, we often hear folks say that ending qualified immunity is going to cost taxpayers. What's your response to this?
Yeah, it's interesting. So no matter what anyone thinks about the bad apples theory, which is, this is all just attributable to a few bad apples. There was a recent study that was done by Northwestern, I think it was a couple of years ago, that showed that the top 1% of police officers who receive the most civilian complaints against them are responsible for 5 times the total payout in civil rights claims as the remaining 99%. So there's an economic sort of basis for, there's something there that I think we see. Now, we live in a world where qualified immunity is still, very strong in Illinois, and there's also statutory tort immunity that's very strong. Why is it that the city of Chicago has paid out more than $500 million in police misconduct, excessive force claims in the past decade alone? CPD absorbs 40% of the entire budget of the city of Chicago, and a very substantial chunk of it clearly is being paid out, and that's with qualified immunity. So you hear people say, well, I mean, imagine if it's $500 million with qualified immunity, it's going to be $1 billion without it. But that's, nonsense, candidly. You only have these massive payouts when you allow people to make a mistake and do something wrong and get away with it and have no accountability, because eventually, Derek Chauvin is an example, someone who had 18 complaints against him, most of which were excessive force. Well, he shirked and escaped and evaded responsibility and accountability for 19 years of his career, and then he killed someone for the world to see. It's a tragedy of, epic proportions. Jason Van Dyke, 18 or 19 complaints, I believe. He, again, the same thing. So what happens is, in the George Floyd case, his family, they settled for, I believe, $27 million with MPD. Now, if Derek Chauvin, if there had been a way to make him accountable before any of those 18 complaints, even a chance, that settlement, we would hope, wouldn't happen. And George Floyd would still be alive, more importantly. So the notion that this will be a big economic issue, I think is just sort of a farcical, and it's sort of cover for real, I think, bad faith reluctance to do the right thing.
Thanks, Peter. All right, so closing minutes. Jerry, I do want to go back to you. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but I'd love if you could share with us as we're wrapping up, why is the movement to end qualified immunity nationwide so important, especially at the state level? In other words, why is it so critical that everybody pick up their phones, call their legislators, and really focus on this bill in Illinois?
Sure. The states are taking the leadership role, and not only that, they are sending a message to people at the federal level. So that's why it's so important. People at the federal level look at what's going on in other places. And, we've had a couple of laws this year. Illinois is poised to do something, and it sends a very strong message that this can be done, that we can establish accountability. Do we really want people on our police forces authorized to carry lethal weapons and not have accountability? It's just kind of crazy, right?
Yeah, as I think Peter said earlier, this is really, a moderate solution. This is not something that's radical or, really out there. This is, a really common sense tool that we should be able to use to hold police accountable. So thanks for sharing that. Final question before we get to closing thoughts. Rep. Tarver, we have so many people watching who have asked about the status of the bill. I know that it's on the House floor right now, but would you share a little bit more about the status, what people can expect in the coming weeks? And then if there are any final, things that people could do in this moment that you think would really make a difference?
I think they have to get started yesterday, because, we have a deadline of Friday for bills to make it out of the House. And so that means it needs to be called by Friday. We're still working a roll call, and very glad to have ACLU really pushing and helping and providing these informative spaces for everyone. But the time is now. We don't have any time to wait. The bill can be called. It's not. There's no reason for it to be held on the House floor right now. But also, we're really working toward a path to get to 60 to ensure its passage.
Thank you, Rep. Tarver, so much for all your work, for introducing the bill, for seeing it through. So as we wrap up, we have 5 minutes left. We want to urge you to take action now. As Representative Tarver just said, the time was yesterday. So at the very least, you can take action right now to help us pass HB 1727. Legislators need to hear from you directly. You can make your voice heard by calling the number on the screen and asking your Illinois House representative to please vote yes on HB 1727 and sign on as a co-sponsor. Here's how it works. You're going to dial the number. You'll hear a recorded prompt giving a brief description of the bill and a few suggested talking points. You will then be prompted to enter your zip code. Depending on where you live, you will either be automatically connected with the office of your House representative or you may be asked to choose the name of your representative from a list. If you don't know the name of your representative, don't worry, we've got you covered. If you need help, click the link in the chat. You'll be able to enter your address and figure out who your state representative is. Legislative offices are closed for the night and calls are going to go to voicemail. That's okay. Please leave a message. Calling this number takes less than 2 minutes. It's something that all of us can do tonight, right now. Additionally, you can send an email to your representative. There's a link in the chat to an email template that you can use and send an email directly tonight. And as you heard the panelists say earlier, it's not enough for just you to take action. Please share this urgent call to action with your family, friends, colleagues, anyone in your network. Post it on social media, start a group chat, make your voice heard, and inspire others to have their voice heard. Share with them about what qualified immunity is. If they have questions, there are lots of materials on the ACLU of Illinois' website, and we would also be happy to answer any questions. If you have outstanding questions, please email events@aclu-il.org. Before we close out, we're going to make a group commitment. We want to know where you all stand. So the final poll is, I will commit to the following. First, calling my legislator in support of HB 1727. I'm going to add a little bit and put tonight behind all of these. Emailing my legislator in support of HB 1727. Sharing about HB 1727 on my social media pages or with my networks, or all of the above. Again, that's calling, emailing, sharing about it on social media pages or with your networks, or all of the above. We highly encourage all of the above. So, again, please call, please email, please share. I want to thank all of our panelists for attending tonight and for their important work to end qualified immunity. Very special shout out to Representative Tarver for, as we have talked about, introducing this bill, working on this, being so committed to the people of, not just the 25th district, but all people in Illinois. This is a really important piece of legislation, and we need all of your support. Also want to thank David and Jerry so much for joining us. This is so wonderful to have you guys in partnership, and Peter as well. Thank you so much for all you do with the ACLU. I want to just thank everybody else for being here virtually. Please stay tuned for updates about HB 1727 and ways to take action over email and social media. If you're not following us on social media, please do. That's where we give all of our updates, calls to action in real time. So please follow us on social media. And again, if you have any questions about the bill or this event, please email events@aclu-il.org. Thank you all and have a good night.